I will talk briefly about the topic of Islamic reform as I have studied it in my own research. And it seems to me that when looking at Islamic reform, you have two types of reform movements in the last few centuries. You have one kind of reform movement that is focused internally, that is focused at the Islamic tradition itself, Islamic practice and belief, and that is focused on the practices and beliefs of other Muslims. So here, the most famous of these reform movements are the reform movements of Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in Central Arabia, a movement that is now referred to as the Salafi movement, sometimes referred to by its opponents or enemies as the Wahhabi movement. And this movement, which I call the Salafi movement, also has um, similar branches or similar movements in other parts of the Muslim world, such as in Yemen, where I have studied the reform movement of the Salafis, but also in India and South Asia generally, with the movement of the Ahl Hadith. In the 19th century, very famously led by Siddiq Hassan Khan of Qanauj. Um, these movements, these Salafi movements, that, as I said, are more inward looking. They look at the practices of other Muslims, and they are offer a critique of those practices. Tend to basically argue the following: that Muslims over time have abandoned the literal interpretation of both the Quran and Hadith, that they have adopted views and ideas and practices that are from sources outside of the Islamic tradition. These practices and beliefs are often referred to as reprehensible innovations, or what is in Arabic called bid'ah, and that Muslims need to go back to a more authentic interpretation of the faith, a more traditional interpretation of the faith that is consistent with the teachings and the beliefs of the Salaf, the venerable ancestors or the forefathers of the first three generations of Muslims. And so when you look at the Salafi movement in Arabia, often it is attacking other Muslims, generally not focused on non Muslims at all, and is not influenced by European or Western um, ideas at all. Generally, they tend to focus on the beliefs of Sufis, and they tend to be critical of Sufi practices and Sufi beliefs, especially the cult of the veneration of saints, or what in South Asia is called Khanqahi Islam. So the Islam of the Dargahs. And generally, that's the criticism of these movements, and they argue for a much more literalist interpretation of the faith. So this is one set of movements, and they've been quite influential and successful in the modern period. This form of Islamic reformist movement has been adopted as the ideology of modern nation states, especially that of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which has promoted these interpretations or these views, not just within the kingdom, but also outside the kingdom, until roughly the year 2015, when the Saudi government decided that it was no longer interested in promoting Salafism internationally, and has essentially stopped, pushing these ideas beyond the borders of Saudi Arabia. And the situation in Saudi Arabia is now in flux, and you have a new government and a new leadership that is trying to, in fact, move away from Islam and Islamic reform towards an ideology that's much more nationalist and much less focused on an interpretation of Salafism. There's another kind of Islamic reform movement that is not so much inward looking, in other words, focused at other Muslims and the practices of other Muslims, but rather that sees that there is a weakness in the world of Islam and among Muslim communities, and that weakness has to do with um, an inability to adapt and cope with the modern world. And therefore, what needs doing is for Muslims to adopt Western ideas, to engage with Western philosophical, political, and cultural concepts, and to adopt some of these or indigenize some of these, make these more Islamic and bring them into the Islamic intellectual tradition. And this movement of reform was very prevalent in India again, because India was by far the most advanced country of Muslims in the 19th century. And we see this, for example, in the Aligarh movement, the movement of Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and the foundation of Aligarh Muslim University, which was basically an attempt to um, develop a modern form of Islam that accepted many Western ideas and sciences. Uh, and this was one attempt also at Islamic reform, which was basically to try to meld or bring together both Islamic tradition with Western tradition. And in the Middle East, this took the form of also a revival movement and a reform movement that we could see with people such as Muhammad Abdu and Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who very much were influenced also by certain Western ideas and tried to adapt these ideas to the Islamic tradition. And Lastly, there was another kind of reform movement that tried to focus more on Islamic law specifically, and tried to reform Islamic law by accepting certain ideas that were already in Islamic law, but were not mainstream, were not central to the Islamic legal tradition. And this you can see with the ideas of Muhammad Rashid Rida, for example, who is a very famous Syrian Lebanese reformer who lived in Egypt, was a student of Muhammad Abdu, and a few other scholars of that period who tried to think of Islam and the reform of Islamic law by focusing on specific concepts. One of these is the concept of the maqasid al-Sharia, namely the purposes of the Sharia, and to try to develop Islamic law in such a way as to make the maqasid, to make the purposes, the intent of the Sharia central to the elaboration and development of Islamic law. This was a tradition that was already found in the Islamic tradition, the maqasid tradition, especially with Maliki jurists such as Shatibi, and this became foundational to modern Islamic reform movements that were focused on the reform of Islamic law. There were also others in this tradition that developed further and tried to bring in European law into the Islamic tradition. Here again, Egypt is central in the first half of the 20th century with figures such as Senhuri, who's an Egyptian jurist. Lastly, I would say there is another kind of Islamic legal tradition, Islamic reformist tradition, that is much more politically focused, that is focused on politics specifically and on the development and reform of Islamic politics, namely to bring politics into the realm of theology and into the realm um, of Islamic law. And here, the principal proponents of this tradition are again Egyptian and mostly centered on the Muslim Brotherhood, the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, Al Ikhwan al Muslimin, with such figures as Hassan al Banna, who was an Egyptian intellectual, died in 1949. Also, Sayyid Qutb, who wrote a very famous um, commentary on the Quran called Fi Zilal al-Quran, who died in 1966 and was killed by the was executed by the Egyptian state. And of course, in the case of Sayyid Qutb, he derived many of his ideas from an Indian scholar called Abu al-A'la Maududi. And here, the focus was much more on politics, or reform understood as the reform of Islamic politics. And it was an attempt to develop a theory of politics that was inspired by a new interpretation of Islam. And this new interpretation of Islam Islam by the Muslim Brotherhood and by Maududi, and was taking many ideas from the West, ideas about the importance of the state, the importance of law, the importance of the state implementing the law. Um, and this tradition became very influential in the 20th century, and we still see the effects of these ideas of politicizing Islam through reform in movements of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Middle East or throughout West Asia. And there are many different branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that have developed these theories. Eventually, there is also a further development within the Muslim Brotherhood tradition, that of um, uh, trying to make democracy in Islam compatible. And this we see in the thought of, for example, the Tunisian Rashid al-Ghannouchi, a very famous Muslim Brotherhood leader in Tunisia, who unfortunately today is in prison. But there is a whole tradition within the Brotherhood that tries to reconcile democratic political practice with Islam. And this tradition of the Brotherhood is very much under attack in many countries in West Asia and North Africa today. Many of its proponents are either living in exile in the West or are in prisons, are in prison in countries such as in Egypt or Tunisia, and uh, and so therefore the entire attempt at reforming Islam or through ideas, whether they are indigenous to the Islamic tradition or from uh, outside sources such as the West, are an attempt by Muslim thinkers um, to bring Islam into the modern period and make it compatible with notions of modernity, but also an attempt to address a sense of weakness within the Muslim tradition that they feel has uh, become pervasive and therefore needs to be addressed through a new interpretation of Islam that is more dynamic, that is more compatible with the modern world, and that will bring back a certain degree of autonomy, agency, and power to the Muslim public and to Muslim publics in general. In the Indian tradition, it seems to me that Islamic reform has taken a number of these forms, but by and large has remained within the tradition of Indian democracy and the strong support for Indian democracy, while trying to experiment with different varieties of Islamic reform within India itself. And India, just like in the 19th century, where Islam in India was extremely dynamic, it seems to me that in India today, we have the possibility again for Indian Muslims to play a central role in the world of Islam and in how to think about the politics of Islam within a modern nation state context, such as that of India.